In this lesson, we are going to learn how we can use loading controller in Ionic. Loading controllers are used in Ionic to display a loading spinner to the user when the application is busy doing something in the background. So it tells your user to wait for a background process to complete, and once that background process is complete, the loading spinner can be dismissed. So in this lesson, we are going to learn how we can use loading spinners in Ionic, and while we do that, we will also learn how we can write asynchronous code in Ionic. A loading controller is an overlay component, which means that it is displayed on top of all other components on our page, and it blocks user interaction. So while the loading controller is being displayed to the user will not be able to interact with the rest of your application. When the loading controller is dismissed, only then the user can resume interacting with the application. So now that we know what is loading controller, let's learn how we can use it in Ionic to display this overlay component to the user. So here I am back inside Visual Studio Code, and I have cleared out everything inside the Ion content. To use a loading controller, you have to write the code inside your TypeScript file. You cannot use loading controller from within your HTML file. However, to display the loading controller, we will need an event. So the user will have to click on a button or something should happen, in response to which we will display the loading controller. So let's go ahead and create a button, and when we will click on that button, we will invoke a function, and inside that function, we will write the code to display the loading controller to the user for 5 seconds. And after 5 seconds, we will dismiss that loading controller. So let's go ahead and create a button first. And there we have our button. I'll bring back the padding attribute on Ion content because the button is touching the edges of the screen. Next, on the click of this button, I want to execute a function. So I'll bind the click event of this button to a function, and let's call this function as show loading. And the next thing that we'll have to do is create this function inside the home.page.ts file. So go ahead and open up your home.page.ts file, and in here inside the homepage class, you need to create this function. To create a function in TypeScript, all you have to do is just type in the name of the function, followed by the list of parameters within a pair of parentheses, and then within the braces, you define the body of the function. To use the loading controller, the first step would be to import loading controller from a package called @ionic/angular. Once you have imported the loading controller successfully, inside the class, you need to create a constructor. The constructor is required because you want to inject the loading controller inside your homepage class. To create a constructor, all you have to do is type in the constructor keyword followed by a pair of parentheses followed by a pair of braces. And this is exactly how you just created the function show loading. So now that you have created the constructor, the next step would be to inject loading controller inside your constructor. So within the pair of parentheses for your constructor, you need to go ahead and type in private, then choose a name for your loading controller instance. I like to use loading CTRL, where CTRL stands for controller, then put in a colon, and after the colon, you can just go ahead and type in loading controller, which means that loading controller is the type and the name of the object or the instance here is loading CTRL. Now inside my show loading function, I can go ahead and write the code to display the loading controller to the user using the loading CTRL object. So here I can just go ahead and type in this dot loading CTRL dot create, and inside the create function, you can go ahead and pass in a JSON object that defines how the loading controller will look like. So the first property inside the JSON object will be message, which actually contains the text that will be displayed on your loading controller. And for now, we are just going to pass in the text loading to the message property. And the create function returns a promise and therefore you can execute the then function on the return value of the create function. So inside the success callback, we'll get a parameter, let's call it loading, and inside this promise, we can just go ahead and type in the present function on the loading object. This will present this loading controller to the user. Let's go ahead and test this out in the browser. So I'll just go ahead and click on this button, and you can see that as I click, I get this loading overlay component in my application, and now if I click anywhere on the screen, nothing happens. And that's because I cannot interact with the application unless this loading controller has been dismissed. And to dismiss this loading controller, you can simply go ahead and call the loading.dismiss function. So let's go ahead and write a timer function here. So I'll use the JavaScript function setTimeout, and I'll set the timer to 500 milliseconds, which will be equal to 5 seconds. And in here, I'll call loading.dismiss, which will automatically dismiss the loading controller after 5 seconds. So let's test this out again in the browser. I'll click on the button, and the loading controller shows up. And after 5 seconds, it is dismissed automatically. And we have written this code using promises. The then function here is a promise which is executed only when the controller is ready to be presented to the user. Another way of writing this asynchronous code is using await and async. So let's go ahead and refactor this code to use await and async and make this code more readable. The first thing I'll do is store the return value of the create function inside a variable. So let's call this variable as loading, and since the create function returns a promise, I can use await here to unwrap this promise. So the value that was previously returned to us inside the promise will now be available to us as the return value and will be stored inside this loading object that we have just created. So now we can go ahead and get rid of all this code here. And we are getting this error because we cannot use await inside a synchronous function. To use await inside the showLoading function, we will have to make showLoading an asynchronous function. And to do that, all we have to do is just type in async before the name of the function. And now you can see that the error goes away. Next, now that we have got a reference to the created controller inside the loading object, we can use loading.present, and to dismiss the loading controller, we'll use the same setTimeout function. So we'll dismiss it using the loading.dismiss function after 5 seconds. And now our code is refactored and is much more readable because it uses async and await instead of promises. The await keyword here makes sure that unless the create function returns a value, the execution will not proceed any further. And once the create function returns the value, it is stored inside the loading object, and in the next step, it calls the present function on the loading object. So the execution only proceeds further once the create function returns. So now let's go ahead and test it out in the browser. I'll click on the button, and the loading controller shows up. And after 5 seconds, it is automatically dismissed. Before concluding this video, let's have a look at some of the properties that we can pass in the JSON object inside the create function to configure how the loading controller looks like. So along with the message property, we can also pass in a duration which takes in the number of milliseconds after which this loading controller is automatically dismissed. So if you are using duration, you will not be using the setTimeout function. Along with duration, you can also pass in a boolean value for show backdrop. And if you set it to false, the backdrop, which is a darker background, will not be visible when the loading controller is displayed. The last property here is spinner, and there are a few values that you can pass in to the spinner parameter. For now, let's go ahead and type in lines here, and let's see how the loading controller looks like. I'll click on the button, and the loading controller looks as it was looking before. Let's change the spinner value to lines-small. And now if I click on the button, you can see that the spinner is much smaller in size. Other parameters that you can pass in to the spinner property are dots, bubbles, circles, and crescent. And all these values that you pass to the spinner parameter will give you a different spinner animation. Feel free to try them out and play around with the loading controller. So now that we know how we can use loading controller to display a loading overlay component to the user, in the next video we'll learn how we can use toast controller in Ionic.